rename yourselves with your name and your organization and your pronouns. We will get started in just a minute as people log in. And welcome. At JPro here, we are committed to starting on time. And I also know that sometimes people are running from another meeting, and on time now with digital clocks looks a little bit different when we're all working from home. But I will start with a few words of introduction. Sam, if you're able to take down the slide. On behalf of the entire JPro team, thank you for taking the time to join us for today's session. My name is Laura Herman. I am the Program and Evaluation Manager at JPro Network. JPro is the organization that is by, of, and for professionals who work in the Jewish nonprofit sector across the United States and Canada. We are tremendously grateful to be partnering with the Mayberg Center and Hillel International for today's session, Covenant and the Legacy of Rabbi Sachs's Teachings for Building Sacred Communities. We will have the opportunity to honor Rabbi Sachs's legacy and engage in some learning about one of his most central ideas. There is closed captioning for today's session that you can access at the bottom of your Zoom screen by clicking on the 3 dots of the Zoom controls and hitting show subtitles. If you're having some trouble, please feel free to direct message me or put in the chat and we can help you. Without further words of introduction, I am delighted to pass it over to Dr. Erica Brown, who will facilitate today's learning.
Hi, thank you, Laura. Thank you all my friends at JPro and Hillel International for hosting this. Rabbi Sachs was a beloved personal teacher of mine, and any opportunity I have that I can bring honor to his name, share his teachings, brings me deep pleasure and delight, and most of all, comfort and solace. I don't know how many of you have ever lost a teacher who's very beloved to you. I can say that, and I'll describe my relationship momentarily, but this year randomly, I will begin crying. I'll think of an idea of his and I'll think of a loss. What a loss it is not to have him. Something complicated will happen in the news. Something will happen in the Jewish community. And I think to myself, what would Rabbi Sachs say? What would he think? What would he teach in this moment? How would he, with his beautiful angelic pen, seem to carry us and inspire us towards hopefulness in a time of desperation and sadness and grief? That was his unique and spectacular gift. So I'll share how I got to know Rabbi Sachs. And we'll do some learning together. When I was 21, I got married, just a babe. My husband was in medical school in London. Medical school in the United States was tens of thousands of dollars, and in London it was free. So it was a no-brainer to move to the UK for some number of years. I did not have a license, and we lived a half a block from Jews College. Jews College is where Rabbi Sachs was the principal, what they called the principal, the head of the college. The college was part of, was started in the 1880s to give ordination to rabbis in the United Kingdom and the English Commonwealth. And Rabbi Sachs was the head, and this was before he became the chief rabbi. Now, my world was very narrow because I couldn't drive and I had a husband in medical school and I was a master's student in education. And therefore, I went to everything that Rabbi Sachs taught. And the second year of my being there, I decided to enroll in a master's with him. If any of you have been to Jews College, which is now the London School for Jewish Studies, it's a very, very small building, which meant all the classrooms were very small. So when I say I had the front seat, that there weren't many rows. And what I was able to witness was the absolute breadth and depth and gallantry of Rabbi Sachs as a teacher. For many of us know him as an author, or we see him as a lecturer, but to have the experience of having papers corrected by him, of saying something and having him refashion it and retool it into something so much wiser and so much larger. And simply to watch his reading list, to hear him recite and rattle off one book after another in sociology and philosophy and economics and psychology. He was interested in demography and statistics. It seemed that everything was of interest to him. I had the great privilege of visiting him in his study in Golders Green, where he used to live. Behind his house, he had what would be called a garage. But of course, why park a car there if you can park your books there? So he had this garage and desk in the middle. And when he, in the summers, he would go into what he would call a trance to write his books. It's very hard to explain simply how prolific he was. And the book list doesn't give the extent of it because of all the articles and other things that he was interested in. But not only that, I had the chance to work side by side with him in Marble Arch Synagogue, where he became the pulpit rabbi, and I spent many Shabbatot teaching there, and also holidays. And one of the things that I noticed, which other people perhaps didn't get to see so much, is Rabbi Sacks is a pulpit rabbi who would hold the hand of an elderly person, make sure that that person had enough to eat for Shabbat lunch, who would start a song. Rabbi Sacks, the singer, start a song and get everybody in the community together. Those were gifts that he had. I ran a program called the Sixth Form Center, which was for high school juniors and seniors who were in what we would call preparatory schools, prep schools. They weren't in Jewish schools, and they wanted sort of a background in Jewish studies to enable them to go to Israel for their gap year. And I would regularly send students to Rabbi Sacks. And in fact, after he died, one student, this was probably 32 years ago, wrote to me and said, do you remember, and I didn't, that you had set me up you set a meeting with me and Rabbi Sacks where I asked Rabbi Sacks some of my theological questions about Judaism. And that conversation changed my life. And after he died, I heard from so many different people, small stories like this one, that after Rabbi Sacks died, 2 prisoners sent consolation notes to Lady Elaine, to Elaine Sacks, who I used to learn with when I lived there. 2 consolations. One of them had been in a prison for murder, and Rabbi Sacks was a correspondent with them. They learned Rabbi Sacks's Torah. They listened to him on the radio. They read his books, and he provided not only comfort, but a deep sense of what atonement might look like. He was famous in his Machzor. He writes for the high holidays that we are not the worst thing that we do, that there is sin and there is atonement, and there is the sense always of becoming. And I think that was true for him as well. Always curious, and always saw the sacred, and always saw the hope in things. And that was a main part of his teaching. And I think ultimately his legacy was not only to turn to the Torah when facing complex situations, but have the Torah shine its light for the world on issues like loneliness and family. And we'll talk about that as we talk about covenant. So when I was thinking about what to say, and as I've been thinking about his Torah, one of the great ways to figure out what Rabbi Sacks cares about is to look at the index of all of his books and see what topics come up again and again. And one of the topics that comes up again and again is covenant. So with your permission, I'm going to go to my source sheet, and something very special on my source sheet. Sorry, try that again. Seems to always work the second time. Okay, here we go. So there's something very special I want to share with you, and that is this photo. This is my favorite photo of Rabbi Sacks. This is when he won the Templeton Prize, which is a very respected prize in the world of faith and religion. And Rabbi Sacks is beaming. And I say that because you'd think that someone with his philosophical background, with his education, and with sometimes the density of the topics that he took on, not only as chief rabbi, but as a writer, that he would be a sort of despondent philosopher. And that was far from the case. Rabbi Sacks walked into a room and the room lit up. And he always told jokes. I can't say they were always good jokes. In fact, I would say most of the time they were old jokes, but when he said them, he sort of amused himself. He had this wonderful art of the story, and he always wore yellow ties. He tried to always wear yellow ties. So if you look at pictures, you'll often find that as a feature. He felt that the yellow tie was sort of, I guess it was the male sign of hopefulness, and compliments his smile in this instance. So the first thing I want to say about covenant and his philosophy of covenant, I think in many ways, it's the most important thing. In fact, if we just stopped here, it would in some way be a good summation of his thinking about covenant. He says a covenant is what turns love into law and law into love. There's an iterative process of what it means to have an agreement with someone. In Hebrew, the term covenant, brit, is an agreement. We enter into a covenant, we enter into an agreement, and that agreement demands things of both partners. It demands that we behave a certain way. It demands that our partners behave a certain way. But a contract and a covenant aren't the same thing. And Rabbi Sacks addresses this difference in a number of his books. So we're going to begin with the covenant is what turns love into law and law into love, and see how we can apply that. So I'm going to look at a series of texts with you on individual covenants and collective covenants. And I want us to think together about the relationship that's being shaped between God and a person or a people, and the similarities and differences in these texts. So the first one, I just want to do a few verses of, and then summarize the rest. This is after, there's in Genesis 14, and we'll see this is, I'm trying to teach in a style of Rabbi Sacks, which Rabbi Sacks would often do a deep, close reading of a text, and then he'd take the sort of 10,000-foot viewpoint of the text and try to put it within a larger modern idiom. So we begin, part of the Abraham narratives, the Abraham story, in Genesis 14 is that Abraham fights in the battle of the 4 kings and the 5 kings. It's sort of one of those chapters that a lot of people just say, you know what, I'll skip that and read that later. That's not the text of Abraham, one of the texts of Abraham that people are well acquainted with. After that, we have this enigmatic transition. אחר הדברים האלה, היה דבר אדוני אל אברהם במחזה, לאמור אל תירא אברהם, אנוכי מגן לך, שכרך הרבה מאוד. So after these things happen, maybe after these battles had happened, the word of God came to Abraham in a dream, and he said, Abraham, have no fear. I am your shield, and your reward will be great. You will get much reward. So that seems to be a lovely gift. If someone says, I'll protect you, don't be afraid, let me and let me give you a reward, I imagine you'd say, thank you very much. That's very kind of you. That is not Abraham's response. Avram, before Abraham becomes fully Abraham, Avram says, Adonai Elohim ma titen li. What are you going to give me? V'anochi holech ariri. I walk childless in this world. Uben demesek beiti, Meshach Beiti, who Demesek Eliezer. So this is very strange. Instead of Abraham politely saying, thanks so much for the gift, even if I'm not going to use it, he says, what will you give me? And I am childless. Do you want Eliezer, my house servant from Damascus, to be my heir? Because Abraham had a challenge. He had a calling and a challenge. The call was build a nation, and every nation, in the covenant of every nation, there are 2 parts. There's the land and then the people. And on the land front, Abraham is doing majestically. He digs wells and he amasses cattle. And he and he buys land and he fights wars, right? So he's developing a name for himself in this region. But on the fertility front, even before God tasks him with going to another land and making his name great, we're told that Sarah cannot have children, that she was an akara, that she was barren. This is very painful. And Abraham tries as he might his whole life, right? Not only in this story in 15, but he brings Lot with him and that doesn't work out. He suggests Eliezer and that doesn't work out. There's Ishmael and all the complexities of that solution that Sarah thought of. And then finally Isaac. But then in Genesis 21, Ishmael is banished And in Genesis 22, Abraham is asked to bind Isaac as a sacrifice. So the fertility quest and the quest to build a people never really leaves him. And I think as Jewish communal professionals, I certainly appreciate this, of not minimizing the difficulties, of saying this may be a calling for us, but that doesn't mean there aren't challenges. And that doesn't mean that there are parts of this job that are easy and parts of it that are difficult. And one of the things that I saw with Rabbi Sacks, I would see him as a Jewish communal servant par excellence, is I think his whole life was about service. He continually thought about ways in which he could develop communities. He could mentor young rabbis and students. He used the gift of his pen to address subjects that other people don't want to think about or aren't prepared to talk about. I'll just share a little story, since we're going to try to enwrap these vignettes with our learning today. His brother Alan, who I'm in touch with, said to me, and he shared this in a Hesped eulogy that he gave at Bar Ilan University. He's the younger brother, and said, here I had this, famous rabbi as an older brother, and I wanted to be a lawyer. And in some way he felt that if he was only a lawyer, he would be betraying this notion of service. He said, and what did my brother Jonathan do? Instead of a normal brother who gives you advice, my brother Jonathan wrote a book. And that book is To Heal a Fractured World. He wrote a book for me. He basically said, and in the book, he was trying to tell me that no matter what job you take in this world, you can be of service to the world at large. You can heal the fracture. You can do tikkun olam. And that was the gift that he gave to me. Now, I'm not sure that that's a gift that I could easily give one of my siblings, but I think it really speaks volumes about the way that Rabbi Sacks brought comfort to his brother and also challenged his brother. So let's go back to Avraham. Avraham basically says to God, this is a person who we typically regard as not challenging God except for Sodom, but not challenging God on his own account. And that's not true. Abraham says to God, you gave me a calling. Now help me figure out how to make it true. And every time there's a separation, when Lot and Abraham separate, God takes Abraham outside and he says, look at the stars in the sky, see if you can count them. And at this juncture also, God will separate Abraham from those from his setting, take him outside and say, Abraham, look at the stars. And I want to use that as a platform to talk a little bit about a covenantal relationship. When you're in a covenant, right, be it a marriage, a long-term partnership, a work relationship, or a partnership with God, and we could talk a little bit more about that later, there's the sense is that it's enduring and that it goes through, is we don't only love someone else when it's easy for us. The test often of relationships, and the test right now for many of us in COVID, is how do you endure difficulties together? How do you overcome challenges that may be perpetual? How do you communicate hope through that to others and to yourself? And I think that's what Abraham does here, is that he questions God, but he does not let go of God. He doesn't break off the relationship. And we'll see that in a moment. Here we are in verse 3, Vayomer Avram, Hein li lo natata zara. You haven't given me children. It was, you haven't given me children. So if you haven't given me a solution, can I come up with my own? And God says no. Then he takes him outside, just as we mentioned. And it says, Ve'amin b'Adonai, we're in 6, v'yachshavel lo tzedakah. Because Abraham trusted, and this is rudimentary to good covenants, is trust. Because Abraham trusted God, God saw the merit in Abraham, and they continued with that trusting relationship. And now is the formal covenant, the Brit Bein Habtarim, that Abraham now will shecht a goat and a ram and a bird, cut these in two and walk through them. And there's something very sort of bloody and uncomfortable about this idea that a covenant is drawn in blood and through death, as a way of suggesting that this is not time bound. The relationship we are beginning will take place forever. Notice this small detail in 11. Birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, and Abraham drove them away. And then a deep sleep fell upon him. And then God says to Abraham, know that your offspring will be strangers in a land not theirs. God gives Abraham what we'll call a destination postcard, a picture of a future that is unimaginable to him now. And Abraham, before he falls asleep, takes away the birds of prey. This isn't a place for predators. This is a place of holiness, of something sacred, of the beginning of possibility. Now, the next covenantal text, and we're not going to do it inside, is when Jacob also falls asleep, and there's a ladder, and the ladder that he has this dream about a ladder with angels of God, Olim v'Yordimbo, going up and down on this ladder. And in this dream, God was standing beside Jacob and standing beside him and said, I am God, the God of your father. We're in verse 13. And the ground on which you're lying, I'll assign to you and your offspring. Your descendants will be the dust of the earth. And I will protect you and I will bring you back. And Jacob wakes up and he says, God is in this place, famous verse, Adonai b'makom hazeh v'anochi lo yadati, and I don't know. Now I know that for many of us, we as Jewish communal professionals are on the front line of making dreams come true, of actualizing things, of being of helping people sort of draw out the best in themselves. And I think sometimes we're not always aware of just what it is that we do. We're not aware of how deep the work is. And so I just want to think about this moment. Jacob understands that God has been in this place, but you don't always know. He didn't know at the time what that actually meant. What does it mean to have God in a place and not know? So I'll just share a quick story. Many years ago, I was privileged to teach as a scholar in residence on a trip to Ethiopia, on a Federation trip to Ethiopia, a JFNA trip. And it was an amazing trip. And at night, for any of you who have been on it, at night, people were singing Oda Vinu Chai in the street as they were walking out of the Israeli embassy towards the airport, and people with white dresses and with bread ovens on their heads. It was so biblical. And I mean, there were so many aspects of that trip of taking 74 people to Israel and sort of taking them in 4 hours across thousands of years of history and everything modern, and being in a plane for the first time and having shoes for the first time. And when I came back, someone said, well, how was your trip? You know, like, how was your trip? And I just didn't know what to say. I said, it was life-changing. They said, well, what do you mean? How is it life-changing? I said, I don't know. I don't know yet, but I know that it has been life-changing. And I think sometimes we go through these experiences because we as Jewish communal professionals create them for other people, and we're on the front lines of them. And so sometimes we understand that something sacred has taken place. We're just not quite sure what it is. And then, of course, there's the collective covenant at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai. And so I want to just focus quickly on the speech that's said before the giving of the Ten Commandments. When you read the Ten Commandments, they're not asking on some level something that requires anything beyond civic, at least the last 5, a basic civic structure for society, not murdering, not stealing, not coveting. Those are sort of basic rules of life. And so what I want to focus on instead is the speech that's given right before that. B'chodesh hashlishi latzei b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim b'yom hazeh bo midbar Sinai. So they're 3 months out of their Egyptian experience, out of slavery, and they enter the wilderness of Sinai. And this is where covenants take place. This national covenant will take place because in the desert, there is nothing. There's no context for you. You can become anything in a place which is wild. And v'yisumer fidim v'yavo midbar Sinai v'yachanu b'midbar. And notice how many times the word midbar, desert, appears. And they camp in front of a mountain. And that to me is so symbolic. On the one hand, there's the flatness of what we assume is the desert, but of course the Negev isn't flat. And when you see a mountain in front of you, this high mountain, it means that something is demanded of you. Something will be challenging. There's something to scale here. Moses easily goes up. God comes down and God says to Moses, you need to say these words. Rashi here says, although Moses paraphrased in places, these exact words must be said. You've seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to me. Right? This is the speech before the covenant. And if you if you obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you'll be my treasured possession among all peoples. Indeed, all the earth is mine. You will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And these are the words. So you need to give this pep talk, because this is the pep talk of love before you get the law. And once you get the law, don't forget the love, because being Jewish will be an iterative covenantal process. Love, which is foundational, and law. Love and law, because love is the emotion, but law is the obligation and the responsibility. And to have a fruitful relationship in covenant means some exchange and interaction of the two of those. They're never free, one without the. I can love you, but if I do nothing for you, I haven't made a covenant for you. And if I make a covenant and everything about our relationship is legal, it will feel transactional. And if I give you all kinds of responsibilities, but I don't tell you, I love you, I believe in you. And right now, you've just come from slavery and all you think is you can do laundry, but in actuality, you can become a nation of priests. You can become just like the Egyptians had their nation of priests. Each of you can become that through this law. If I don't tell you I believe in you, you're not going to want to do this. And we know this in Jewish communal service. When we work for people who are mission driven, who are kind, who are loving, who are mensches, we go through fire for them. But if they're not that, and push comes to shove, we're out. So I think God is trying to say to Moses, you can't impart every one of these words. You can't miss any one of these words, because without them, we can't frame what it will mean to accept the law. So now, with all this in mind, let's go to Rabbi Sacks for a few minutes. Rabbi Sacks, The Home We Build Together, I'll talk about that book in a moment. It is not a book. I don't even know if it was actually published in the United States. And so I'll talk about it in a second. This is a distinction that he makes between a contract and a covenant. What God is proposing at Sinai is not a contract, but a covenant. Covenants were a familiar feature of politics in the ancient Near East. They were secular treaties, usually between a strong nation and a weak one. They set out the terms of a relationship. The strong power could protect the weak, in return for which the weak would pledge its loyalty and fealty to the strong. So up until this point, a covenant was a way that I could ask someone who didn't have my power or stature to be bound to me, and I could exploit them. In other words, a covenant cemented a hierarchical relationship. The Bible takes this idea, Rabbi Sacks says, and this is remarkable, and makes revolutionary use of it. It's now conceived of as a partnership between God and a people. God will protect them. They know this because he's already rescued them from slavery. In return, they're to pledge themselves to God, obeying his laws, accepting his mission, honoring his trust. The people are free to choose. The fact of choice is fundamental, for the Bible portrays God not as an overwhelming force, but as a constitutional monarch. The supreme power makes space for human freedom. So now let me tell you what book this comes about, a little bit about this book. Rabbi Sacks, if you follow his writing patterns, generally wrote books internally for the Jewish community. Those would be commentaries on the Siddur or the Machzor, or books of Jewish thought. But then he wrote books very often in between. He would write books on certain topics that he felt were important for Jewish wisdom to challenge and provoke trends that he saw, negative trends that he saw in society. So, for example, Morality is just such a book. His last book that was published, that I would categorize as a book that he wrote in large part for society at large, taking Jewish wisdom and sort of bringing it out to the nations. And The Home We Build Together is in that category. That is a book that he wrote because he saw multiculturalism in Europe and in England in particular as an abject failure. His idea, and he described it this way, it's like an immigrant comes, it's as if an immigrant comes to your country and there's a country home that you build and you invite the immigrant to your home and you say, have anything that you like here. It's lovely to have you. The immigrant feels chuffed at being invited to this home. And yet, on the other hand, the immigrant also senses that none of this is his or hers. He's not able to walk to the refrigerator, for example, and to get something to eat. He's dependent on the favor and grace of the host. And he said, England is like a country home. And that's not the right formula. It needs to be, we need to build a home together. And that's why he called this book The Home We Build Together. And his concern was that the relationship with immigrants was a contractual relationship as opposed to a covenantal relationship. So it's a new way of framing for many of us, something, an internal speak to an external speak of how we think about immigrants, what kind of policies we have to encourage immigrants to be part of society and to be truly and deeply integrated. So let's keep going because he'll talk about this more in his book, The Dignity of Difference. This book, which had some controversy attached to it, which I won't discuss, but I'm happy to do that offline. The Dignity of Difference was based on lectures that Rabbi Sacks gave to the World Economic Forum. And he talked a lot about what he thought money's use is and money's limitations. Covenant, he says, is an answer to the most fundamental question in the evolution of societies. How can we establish relationships secure enough to become the basis of cooperation without the use of economic, political, or military powers? The use of power is ruled out by the requirement of human dignity. If you and I are linked because one way or another I can force you to do what I want, then I have secured my freedom at the cost of yours. I've asserted my humanity by denying yours. Covenant is the attempt to create partnership without dominance or submission. And here he goes on to one of several definitions that he will make of a covenant. The distinction between a covenant and a contract. A covenant is not a contract. It differs in three respects. It's not limited to specific conditions and circumstances. It's open-ended and long-lasting. And it's not based on the idea of two individuals otherwise unconnected, pursuing personal advantage, as one might in a business deal. Remember, this is Rabbi Sacks addressing the World Economic Forum. And he says, guys, you've got it wrong. All of the time you're preoccupied with contracts, but society, to be compassionate, to be loving, to be humane, has to be about covenants. And he says it's about the we that gives identity to the I. There's a place for contracts, but covenants are prior and more fundamental. Now, for those of you who read Morality, you know that he talks a great deal about I versus we. In that book, he addresses, not for the first time, but many times, he addresses the issue of loneliness in society and how it's manifest. He was very concerned with one particular contract, and that was marriage. He writes very frequently about family life and the importance of family life and the family as the microcosm for community. And he felt that the family is where covenants truly take place, because although there are rules and laws that govern the way we interact with each other, those laws are framed always by love. Love is prior and more fundamental to them. And he saw that as a microcosm for what society needed to be, and that the family and deep friendships, the community, were places where we learn these things. He was deeply distressed over the breakdown of community. And I would say in many ways he gave his life to this. In a eulogy that I wrote for him, I saw him, I can't remember the last time that I actually saw him in person. We were at a conference and I said, Rabbi Sacks, you told me last time I saw you that you were retiring and you were slowing down, but I've seen all that you're doing here and I'm reading things that you're writing and it doesn't seem that you're slowing down at all. And he looked at me with that twinkle and he said, God isn't finished with me yet. I think he understood that retirement was only letting go of maybe organizational platforms. But that didn't mean that the work ever stopped, because if you're in service and you're in a covenant, again, what he just said, the covenant endures. And again, in the home we build together, it's a binding commitment. And he talks about he says, what difference does it make, right? Covenant is politics. We're now right here in the middle. Covenant is politics without power, economics without self-interest. What difference does it make? For one thing, it gets us to think about the common good, the good of all of us together. And here, he'll have a nod to the family relationship. Those bound by a covenant voluntarily undertake to share a fate. They choose to link their destinies together. They accept responsibilities to and for one another. They redeem the solitude of the lonely crowd. To enter into a covenant, like deciding to marry or have a child, is to take a risk, an act of faith in an unknown, unknowable future. When you make a covenant in marriage, you don't know what the future holds. And I want to talk a little bit for a moment about this unknown, unknowable future, because I think all of us right now have had a year plus of an unknowable present, right? And certainly an unknowable future. And a lot of people are, if any of you have read Adam Grant's wonderful article in the New York Times, we're languishing. It's not, some may be depressed and struggling with mental health issues, but a lot of us are languishing. We're people. We went into this to build community, to have retreats, to take people to places, to go to camp together, to go to schools together, all those things that we're not able to do in person and not able to do adequately online. And so the sense that maybe the covenant breaks down as a result, and we languish as a result, because it's very hard. Many of us, I don't know about you, I've worked harder this year than I've worked my entire life, and felt less validated and less useful than ever. Maybe because the mountain of issues is something that I realize that I can't scale. And the feeling of frustration, can we really help when we can't take away the thing that people need most, which is we want to take away COVID. We want to give them good health. We want them to be free of losses. We want them to feel recovery and healing. And how can we guarantee that? We can't. And so this has been a very, very frustrating year. And it's important to think a little bit about the self-care that's necessary. And when I say self-care, I sometimes when I hear it, I roll my eyes. It's not like we're rushing on vacation, but there are things that we need to do to make sure that we have the energy to continue, that when we're languishing, but we're watching our energy dissipate all these months in, and that we think about how we can sustain that energy, because we are in a covenantal relationship with those we serve, and we're going to be here tomorrow. And we don't want, as marathon runners, I'm not a marathon runner, but they say of marathon running, you don't make a difficult decision on a hill, right? We're not deciding to leave. Now, there are people I'm hearing, early retirement, I can't do this one more day. But we're not making these decisions on a hill. We're making these decisions with the notion of an enduring covenant and our role in building that covenant. So I just want to end with one thought. Covenant is the politics of quest for the promised land, the place of freedom, the society that honors the dignity of all. It's not enough to be in a relationship. For Rabbi Sacks, the question is, where is that relationship taking you to? What are you building as a result of the partnership that you've created? What's the place of freedom you are taking others to? What's the promised land? What's the society that honors the dignity of all? And on top of all of our COVID misery, we've had to handle the deep pockets of racial injustice all over and unending, and political unrest. And I think I understand why it might feel easy to give up. Or one might say, I'm in a covenantal relationship. Now is the time to lean in. So I'm going to stop the share, and I'm going to make a request. And the request is that we take a moment, and I'll just give us 2 minutes of time to write our own covenant. To write a covenant, which is basically your own commitment to the Jewish community. And by that, I mean, not in terms of an organization. You may have moved organizations, you may be moving organizations, you may have those thoughts, there might be somewhere else where you can work, but I want you to really make a covenant of service. And I want you to say what share them publicly, but we will do a group breakout. And so I'm going to ask you I'm going to time 2 minutes, and I'll ask each of you to write down your covenant of service. And you may want to begin with, I commit to, and I will time that 2 minutes, and I'm going to write one myself. Okay, we are at 2 minutes. So I'm going to ask my friends at JPro to magic us into groups for, let's just say 7 minutes, okay? Or 6 minutes, let's say 6 minutes, all right?
Thank you so much. Everybody is in a group of 3 individuals. Before you share a little bit about what you write, please take a moment to briefly introduce yourself to your colleagues. And with the magic of Zoom, my colleague Sam will whisk you away, and we will give you a little bit of a warning so that you don't get cut off mid-sentence when we bring you back. We will see you soon. Everybody, I think we'll give it another couple of seconds for the breakout rooms to close. I hope that you enjoyed your conversations together and sharing what you wrote. And I will pass it back over to Dr. Erica Brown to continue our learning.
All right, we'll just be Erica. How about that? I hope that you had as energizing an encounter as I did with my group. And I hope this has given us a chance to think about how we use the term covenant in the work that we do, how we build covenants with other people and the relationships that we have, and how we build covenantal communities. And I think that's really one of Rabbi Sacks's great legacies, is introducing that word and actually having it as an aspiration for all of us. I have a friend who does a great job of building covenantal communities of intention. So I want to introduce Rabbi Ben Berger, who's the vice president of Hillel International, vice president for education of Hillel International. And more importantly for me, he's someone I've had a covenantal relationship with many, many years. And I'm so grateful for your friendship, Ben. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this exercise and on your relationship that you had with Rabbi Sacks.
Thank you, Erica. What a joy to, first of all, learn with you, as I have many times before, and it never gets old. So thank you. And it's always a little intimidating to follow you, but I'm for the sake of being able to honor Rabbi Sacks's memory and legacy, it's just a tremendous honor for me to share a word. I didn't have the pleasure, the honor of being a student up close in the same way that Erica was with Rabbi Sacks. But I sense that I share this with many of you, that I too was a student of his and felt a a sense of deep closeness to him, despite the distance. I have an entire bookshelf filled with his books that I come back to day after day. And in fact, I've had many rabbis and many rebbes and many wonderful teachers in my life, but I can say that there are few whose teachings I see, I read, I think about on a daily basis in the way that I have with Rabbi Sacks's teachings over the last 20 years. And I think that that's also just what was so incredible with him. His reach was so long that so many of us, no matter where we were, where we are, what age we are, what level of direct exposure we had to him, feel like his students, and also feel the tremendous loss in this world. There's few voices I would have wanted to have learned from more over the last year than his, to bring us moral clarity in a time of real darkness. So that loss is great. Also, I'll say in the spring, as COVID, the pandemic began, I reached out to him, to Rabbi Sacks, to see if he would provide words to students, to college students, in a time of real fear, dislocation, and alienation even. And he did very graciously. And knowing now, it was just days later that the announcement of his cancer diagnosis was excuse me, was given, that was sort of probably even on his mind then. But just before the graduation of last year, he gave an address to nearly 1,000 students who joined, and he gave a message of hope and connection in a time where people really didn't feel that connection. And the response we got from so many who were on was that he really did provide that sense of hope, and such gratitude for the words that connected them in that moment. So with that, I'm thinking just about Hillel's mission and my covenantal relationship to Hillel, and the ways that I feel so deeply committed to students and to the wellness of students and to the learning of students. And I make it my own personal mission, and the mission of my team and our organization, to bring a sense of love, law, of learning, of responsibility and connection to Jewish students all over the world. And I just want to share what I wrote as well. And it's an honor to be able to do this. And I just wrote this on the spot as well. It's not well worked out. I commit to remembering that I am part of something that existed long before me and will continue long after me. I understand that the work that I do matters, and that I will serve with love every day, but that when I miss the mark, when I fail, which is inevitable, I will be forgiven and the work will survive. As part of that, I understand that the ways I fulfill my mission, and the mission of my organization, and the mission of the Jewish people, is no less than life-changing and life-giving. These were lessons that Rabbi Sacks taught me, and I suspect so many of us, that you elucidated so beautifully today, Erica. And I'm so grateful for the ways that you did, so that I can feel, in a sense, a deeper sense of covenantal relationship with the work that I do, and with you all as colleagues, and a sense that we will continue to do this for a long, long time, and our future is bright in that. Thank you. I'll hand it over to Laura, I believe.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing your words that you wrote with us. I'd like to also just invite everybody who's here participating to share their covenant that they wrote in the chat, if you're interested, or if you don't have time to type it all out completely, feel free to share a couple of your ideas. And I will share one of the things that stood out to me most as Erica was teaching was the concept of love, which is what I focused on in my very short and simple covenant that I wrote, where I wrote, I commit to leading with love in my relationships and thinking about what people need first as I interact with them. I see that there are a few coming in here, and it's great to see what you wrote, what you were thinking about, and the commitments that we all have in our work as Jewish communal professionals. I'll just give people another minute to type them out as we prepare to conclude. to serving to improve, to, oh, it's hard to read the chat out loud. Giving honesty and fully of myself to the donors and members that I work with. Thank you, Saul. Remembering that our work is holy work. Thank you. To serving God for all of my days in effort, intentions, and learning. Thank you, Jeff. These are really beautiful. I don't know if I can read all of them aloud, but you can see them popping up here, and I invite you to read them in detail, probably a little bit more detail than I'm able to do at the moment. As we conclude, I would like to just, really extend a very big thank you to Erica Brown for sharing your thoughts today. As I said to you in our short breakout room, I was personally very touched by the way that you integrated your relationship with Rabbi Sacks into your teaching. And it was a personal honor of mine. I too have a bookshelf filled with his books and consider myself to be a student of his. And it was an honor to get to know him in a very different way that I've never experienced before. I also want to thank Rabbi Benberger from Hillel for your partnership on this program and your creative thinking as we prepared for today's session. And just as a word of closing from JPro, I'd like to, my colleague will share in the chat a link to some of our upcoming programs. We currently have 7 different master classes on offer and another JPro online session coming up in the middle of May. Please feel free to check out everything there. And if you have a moment, we would love to hear your feedback on today's session. My colleague will also put a link in the chat to our feedback form. We will collect these covenants that you wrote and think about how we can share them more with the entire JPro audience. And thank you so much again for joining us. We hope you have a good rest of your day.